Um, okay, cool. Well, I guess like what the purpose of the podcast is to provide the listener, provide if it's an athlete, or coach, or parent, something that they didn't know going in, something that can be helpful in a practice, in a game, in preparation. I've interviewed athletes, I've interviewed coaches, physical therapists, but I think you provide like a really amazing perspective on um, you see elite athletes on a daily basis. And I'm always asked, like, what is the difference between a major league baseball player and a minor league baseball player? Some of it's skill, but it's consistency. And it's the ability to understand failure and move past failure very quickly. I guess my first question for you that would be like, what is that thing that separates the elite from what you see on a daily basis?
Yeah, I like your answer. I think your answer is interesting. And we could unpack that. And I'm excited to spend some time with you on this stuff. Hopefully, I can give you some actionable things that are useful. I purposely left your forum open ended so that you'd be forced to take me wherever you think your audience wants to go. And so that I wasn't pigeonholing myself into something that I didn't really want to talk about for 45 minutes. So hopefully that's okay with you. I think to answer the question super directly, I mean, I'm a pretty data driven guy. And so a lot of the research supports the idea that self-regulation is probably the most critical factor in separating elite athletes from their slightly less elite counterparts. And the way I think of self-regulation is really two parts. The first is the ability to control and direct your thinking, feeling, and physiology, right? So learning where to put your attention, understanding how your thoughts and feelings impact your behavior, learning how to moderate your arousal level, and being able to sort of control some of that. And then the second part is what's called self-regulated learning, which is really the ability to kind of set goals, monitor progress, evaluate, and adjust. It's sort of like an adjunct to deliberate practice, although for several reasons I can get into why I don't think deliberate practice is the right answer. And so though that factor for me, that broad self-regulation, which could be understood as like discipline, commitment, self-mastery, kind of like a hodgepodge of those things, I think is what really ends up separating the best athletes from the rest.
When either throughout the season or in the off season, when an athlete, well, what is the most common thing that someone comes to you with?
Yeah, I mean, there's not like there's not really a specific thing. I mean, it's hard. Like when I was in college, working with college athletes, elite college athletes, I often sort of kidded that like sleep is the gateway to a lot of stuff for elite athletes. It's a measurable thing. It's something people are comfortable talking about. It's not very taboo for people to say, oh, my sleep sucked last night or I didn't sleep too well. And so sleep can often be a gateway into people coming in for help. Hey, I'm not sleeping super well. And then you unpack it and maybe it's performance anxiety or there's other issues going on at home. So I think that's one. I think other things people tend to come for are, we go through cuts, right, and roster management. And so when people are concerned about their status on the team, that's a common time for people to come in and seek support and start thinking about how they can give themselves the best chance. And then I think there's a lot around just transition and managing the length of the season, right? We play 82 regular season games. Your role changes on a nearly night-to-night basis, unless you're one of the absolute no-brainer starting five people, of which there's only a handful in the NBA anyway. So those things I think are the common ones that people are looking for some support on.
What's really cool about, I think, what we do is we bring together football players and soccer players and basketball players and baseball players to have conversations that they weren't having otherwise, but that there might be a component that a baseball player does that might be valuable to a football player. What is it in basketball that is that valuable component that can possibly be conveyed to an athlete in another sport?
Well, I think you'd probably be better served asking a pro player than me. I'm not out there on the court like doing it. I think from an observational perspective, like what I think basketball is super unique because you've got a failure rate comparable, maybe slightly less than baseball, right? Like baseball, you're an incredible Hall of Fame player if you're batting 300. Basketball, you're like a okay shooter if you're batting 300, but you're a world-class shooter if you're scoring 45% of the time, right? So you're still dealing a lot with failure. I think that's an interesting like point of overlap. I think when you look at like football, there's a lot of like conceptual similarities between how players manipulate space and the way we think about taking over a court. So I think that's interesting. But what I think is maybe unique about basketball in terms of maybe comparisons to baseball and football, and it's a similarity to hockey and soccer, I think, is the continuity of the game, right? Like you could have 4 minutes in a row of completely uninterrupted basketball play with very, very minor starts and stops for taking the ball out of bounds in between. And so I think having to sustain attention and focus and energy for that period of time is very, very taxing. But for any athlete, whether you get a break or not, learning to pay attention for stretches of 5, 10, 15 minutes at a time is a pretty valuable skill. And so I think mastering that and being able to sort of pull yourself in and out of the focus for an extended period of time is one I'd take from basketball and give to the other two you mentioned.
Okay, so take me into, we're on the court, and this is actually really exciting for me to really think about this. So we're on the court, and I missed 4 threes in a row. I can't make a shot. I'm not doing what I need to do. I'm out of my body. I'm not feeling good. Guys aren't coming to you during the game to talk. So what are some ways that an athlete of any sport, but for the basketball players that are listening, that they can do to prepare for moments like that, where they can, what techniques are available to them to help them get back into flow or a zone where they can really get back to that skill that they have?
Yeah, so for me, I tend to use like a pretty simple 3-step formula for these kinds of things, which is around release, reset, and refocus, right? So the release is coming up with some sort of physical action, cue, movement that allows you to actively let go of the additional pressure that's building up around missing the shots, the internal dialogue you have around making mistakes or not performing well, the stress that you're feeling, the concern you feel about the coach pulling you out of the game, right? These are all things that start running through your mind when you've missed 4 shots in a row. Like, oh, the coach isn't going to call a play for me anymore. I might as well go to the bench. I suck. It's all coming to an end. So I think we have to first release that stuff, just let that stuff go. Then the reset is around coming back into your physical presence, right? You talked about being out of your body. So it's like, maybe it's a deep breath or a quick grounding exercise where you pay attention to your physical movement or giving yourself a physical cue, right? So for the next, 5 seconds of this play, I'm just going to focus on giving my best effort, or, I'm going to take this moment while the ball's out of bounds and gently push my feet into the ground, right? Like something that brings you back into the body, into the moment, into the here and now. And then refocus is around directing your attention at things you can control, right? So you can't always control if the shot goes in. In fact, there's fairly, aside from getting off a good shot and making the right decision, like once the ball's in the air, you can't change it, right? So some shots are going to go and some shots aren't going to go. And so that's not really a metric we want you focused on, right? Is when makes or misses, as much as we want you focused on putting yourself in the position to get the best shot you can. And so what could you refocus on? And in that instance, it might be something like running hard to your spot, getting around screens effectively, giving good effort, making the extra pass, right? These are all things that can get you back into the flow of the game and help you to recover from that series of 4 misses. So that would be the process I would use to kind of get out of it. So how do you prepare? You practice that strategy, right? You practice when you've made a mistake, doing that simple release, reset, refocus after each mistake. So it becomes kind of habitual and it becomes a thing that you can leverage when you need it. Nothing can fully prepare you for what it feels like to miss 4 shots in a row at the NBA level with a minute to go and you lose the game, right? But you can like try to practice some of the things that'll help you should you find yourself in that moment.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to think about like that elite level. I think I've never been around. It's certainly been to like, Phoenix Suns games and seen players in person, but I've really never been around like an elite basketball player, football player. Elite baseball players, sure. And they thought differently. I could see like their pregame preparation was different. When you're with teams or you see other teams and you're around athletes that are of this caliber, what has surprised you? I don't know how long you've been with the Raptors, but what has surprised you around being athletes of this level?
So I've been with the Raptors for about 3.5 years now, and I think there are a few things that surprised, right? So one is, well, it's not really a surprise, but I think it goes unrecognized of like how normal some of the players can be, right? Like there's a pretty recent quote from Damian Lillard talking about like being a normal guy, right? Like he hangs out with his kids, he spends time with his grandma, he talks to his uncle on the phone. Like he has normal human existence like the rest of us. And I think as a fan or as an outsider, right, we often think like, oh, these guys must have everything and they just spend every night like living it up and having the best life of all time. And it's like, look, there's a time and place where everyone has fun, but by and large, like most of these guys are pretty normal guys and want to have a somewhat normal life. So I think that's an interesting one. I think from a performance standpoint or thinking about how they manage themselves, like the best athletes I've been around at this level, either in the NFL or the NBA, there's just a level of commitment to the craft and to excellence that is just not matched in most places. And so, it's interesting because sport is one of the few places where you really get an opportunity to like practice and refine and practice and refine, and you're not constantly performing like other performance domains. You're almost always on, if you think about it, right? Like lawyers are constantly arguing, physicians are constantly operating, business people are constantly running the business. There's no like practice time. But I think the best athletes use that to their full advantage, and practice time is not time to just mess around or not give great effort. And so, I've been fortunate to see like future Hall of Fame guys like a Kyle Lowry, who it's just like their commitment to what they're trying to do is unreal. And it's hard to even imagine as a normal person how someone can sustain that for 15 years, 16 years, whatever it is. So I think that's probably the one that jumps out most, is like seeing it live is really pretty inspiring and pretty motivating to see someone be so committed. And then I think, the last thing is like when you watch a game on TV, it's hard to appreciate just how physical and fast the game actually is. But basketball is a very physical game, which is not something I expected coming from the football world. And the player, like even though what we think are the worst NBA players are still some of the most like incredible athletes, physically gifted, mentally pretty resilient people that you'll ever come across. And so it's almost like my view is warped a little bit, but I think those things are pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. I think what you said was really important about like the commitment to being great. We have a lot of like high school athletes that participate in some of the things that we do, and I think a lot of the messages that we try to convey are around that, like consistency, like not only just waking up at the same time, getting quality sleep, but the effort that you put in practice and the effort that you put in the game and in the weight room, and in some of the stuff that we do, to really like round that out for like certainly the parents that are listening that have the eyes and ears of their kids and of their athletes, the coaches that are listening as well. But for those athletes specifically, like what are some things that tangible things that they can use, that they can utilize, that you see some of the best athletes in the world doing to stay and remain the best athletes in the world?
So just so I'm clear, things coaches and parents can do to kind of support that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, counterintuitive answer here perhaps, but like the first thing is to not only talk to your kid about sports. So like to have an opportunity to know your athlete, a high school athlete, as more than an athlete is pretty important, and making sure that you emphasize that and help them develop other parts of their identity will actually help them perform better. What will happen is they'll put a little bit less pressure on what it means to be an elite athlete, and it'll make the game come a little bit more naturally. Now, if you're a coach, it doesn't mean, you're going out talking about what you guys do this weekend and asking a million personal questions, but it does mean investing in the person a little bit more than just investing in the player. So that's one thing. And then I think the main thing for coaches and parents to think about is really the feedback that you give and the language that you use. I mean, parents and coaches have a really big responsibility and a really big impact on how athletes think, feel, and perform, right? So if you as a parent If the first thing you do after your kid loses a game is double down on the mistakes they made in the game, you are teaching your kid that after a mistake or after a loss, all they should do is focus on what went wrong. And over time, that's not a really adaptive response. That played out once might be fine. That played out 5,000 times over the course of their lifetime is not great. And so what's happening is you're teaching them that, like, oh, well, when they have a mistake in their career as a business person, right, or they lose a pitch, or they lose a court case, or they fail a sale, what they should do is criticize themselves, right? So we've got to be really careful about what we select and the type of feedback that we give. On the other hand, if after a loss, we do something like emphasize effort, right? We say, hey, look, you tried really hard. You played really hard that game. What did you do this game that you want to keep doing? Now, all of a sudden, you're using language that's non-judgmental, is purely observational. You're teaching them to be a scientist about their own performance, and they're not in a place where they're judging or criticizing themselves. They're starting to think about more productively and proactively, what, even in a loss, there's stuff that I did well. There's stuff that I should continue. What is it that I might continue? You can ask them a similar question. What should I do differently, right? It doesn't mean you're always going to do it differently, but what's another thing that you could pick up from this loss that all of a sudden might be helpful for you in the future? And you're teaching someone a very different set of skills now. It's not, oh, let's criticize every time we fail. It's, hey, there's something to be learned here. There's a way we can approach this that's useful. So I think giving feedback around effort, giving feedback around hard work, doubling down on strengths, right? And really emphasizing what people do well, spending less time worrying about fixing weaknesses. Like, there's a whole debate around whether or not that's actually a good use of time. But my argument is it's not really. Like, you should, correct them to the extent that they're not going to completely implode your game. And beyond that, you should spend a lot of time focusing on making the best skill that you have, the best skill it can be, because at the highest levels of sport, that's what separates people. Like, Steph Curry is in the NBA because he's the best shooter in the world, not because he's the best athlete or anything else, right? But he's got this incredible elite skill that allows him to stick around, which happened a lot by focusing on his strengths, not by, oh, he was a terrible shooter and he became the best shooter ever. That story does not really exist, right? The stories that exist are, oh, he was a good shooter and he became a great shooter. And so by spending that time on the strengths, I think you have an opportunity to really create a sticky athlete and to make the experience more enjoyable. And then the last thing is to end on that is, like, have fun, right? Like, as a parent or a coach, like, this is still supposed to be a sport. I hate to be the bearer of bad news for the audience, but like, the odds that your high school athlete becomes a well-paid NBA or professional athlete are like 0.02%, right? Like, incredibly small odds. And that doesn't mean don't try, but it does mean you probably shouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. So if you're a high school coach, don't pretend that you're coaching pro players. It doesn't mean don't take your job seriously. It just means you have to be realistic about the audience that you have. If you're a high school parent, it doesn't mean don't shoot for the stars. It just means be realistic about what the possible outcomes are here and parent accordingly.
That was great.